Ervin. I'm an artist, a printmaker, a teacher, and I also make paper. So I'm here to talk about how the early printing process was important for not only Europe but also the colonial days. So the first thing I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about what printmaking is, or printing. Basically, printing is just taking a surface like this. You take a surface and you either dip it in ink, or you can roll ink on here. You can use a ball to put your ink on, and then you just press it onto something. Now, printing as we know it, as books and things like that, they use those as everything was handwritten because they didn't have any way to do entire books. So they might have created a whole book on one piece of wood, and they'd carve it all out. And of course, sometimes maybe knife slips and oops, well, we don't have that letter in the word again. So that could, because there weren't that many of these, and so that's probably the beginning of it. But actually, the real beginning is when you're taking this as a print and it is put on cloth, because they didn't have any paper back then, way back then when they were doing these types of print. The paper was not invented yet, believe it or not, and so they printed on either silk or cloth and use them for clothes, so they would have bright colors and things with natural dyes. So when did printing start? In Europe, it started around 1350. That's way a long time ago. After that, it became a huge industry. But the one thing that you have to remember is first, what did they print on? Because they didn't have anything to print on, there wasn't any reason to make prints, and so they had to have paper. Well, paper wasn't really invented until 100 AD, which is about 2,000 years ago, but really that wasn't that long ago in the scheme of things when you think about cavemen and all that. So paper is made from mulberry tree or bark from trees, and it's pulped up, crushed up, and soaked in water and soaked in all kinds of things that will make it move. And so then they would take screens and lift the paper out and then dry those, and they found that you could write on that, and it was really a nice, inexpensive way to write something. Before we had paper in the Dark Ages, and we used animal skins like vellum and parchment, which are sheep skins and goat skins and things like that. Those had to be soaked and scraped and stretched just to make something that you could write on. So you would find paper that had like teeny little things written on the edge, and people would scrape it off and use it again. So it wasn't one of those things that you really had. Of course, before that, there were clay tablets and cuneiform writing, which they would take a little stick and push it into the clay, and the clay would dry. You start thinking about how much we use paper and how much we use printing. If you can imagine all your textbooks made out of clay tablets, that would be just a lot of stuff to carry around every day. You'd have to have just like a big wheelbarrow, everybody, just carrying all your books home for whatever. So you think your backpack's heavy now, it's going to be really heavy then. So thank goodness we found the paper. We got it from the Chinese, who happened to come over and on a trading route, and there were two Chinese printers, and the people in the Muslim world, they were able to discuss and exchange ideas. And so in Spain and any of the Moorish areas, they used the paper. And of course that around 1300 that came to Italy, and then it moved up to Germany. Any place that had a lot of good water, that's where they started making paper. And so paper was wonderful, and what they would use was rags. You had a little person that would go around, or people would set their old rags out, and they really used their clothing until they were rags. And so you had people called rag pickers. All they could do is go around and get the rags and hand them, and then they'd pulp those up into pulp, and then they'd make paper out of them. So that kind of paper is probably the most durable. Your money, if you look at any dollar bills, is made from rags. It's made from cotton pulp fibers, wool fibers that are put into the mix. And so it's made out of paper, but it's also very durable. How many of y'all have ever washed your money and it still comes out the same, you know? So I have a little saying here that says, rags make paper, paper makes money, money makes banks, banks make loans, loans make beggars, and of course beggars make rags. So it's one of those things that is so true as the way it moves. Most of the paper that we use today is created from pine trees or pine pulp, and it's inexpensive because they planted it specifically for making paper, so the rows are nice and straight and it's easy to harvest, but it doesn't last as long as the rag paper. So now you know why when you wash that homework in your pocket in the washing machine, it doesn't come out like the money, right? All right, so once we have paper, they decided that they could print things. So they would cut whole pieces and start printing them. They would hand rub those things, but then eventually there was a fellow named Johannes Gutenberg in 1400s. He was a goldsmith, and so he was used to working with metal. And he started thinking, well, if we could, instead of carving all these little letters out, we could make them out of metal or out of the super hardwood that they did. They started carving them out. Well, the letters weren't, they were, you know, this is a nice example, but it's not as small as they needed it. And they had to carve things super, super small in order to be able to print a whole page of a book. What was so special about this was he was not carving just one big old plate to put under and print with. He was carving individual letters. And so, you know, you could do the A-N-D or A-N-T, and it was quick. You didn't have to recarve that word, so they could have that. Eventually, people started using, they got smaller and smaller and smaller, and I know that you can't see this very well, but this is an O that is made from a piece of metal. And you think about when you go on your computer how small those fonts can be on there, and I'm sure all of y'all have experimented with that sort of thing in your computer labs. So once they discovered that, hey, we can move the type, we can say things quickly, we can print it easily and cheaply because we have the paper, then all of a sudden this explosion of education. Not many people were able to read back then. The only thing that really kept the paper industry and the printing industry going was the fact that they could print books, and they would use it for the playing cards. People like to play cards. They couldn't read, but they could play cards. And then you had religious imagery. When they went on pilgrimage, they would go to a site, and they would get a little print from somebody. They could buy it, and it was easy to roll up and tuck in their bag, and the person that printed could print lots of them, so he could make money. So it became a big industry. So with Mr. Gutenberg's press, he was able to make books and books and books, and then the learning of everybody in the world became a high priority. When you see a press like this would be a great big screw lever. Instead of this little press where I can screw this up and down, they had one that they had to screw up and down, and then they had a great big handle on it. And instead of the people turning the handle, what they would have to do they would have to pull the handle, like this man. And he is pulling that handle back, and it makes the press part go down and press on top of the paper. With my small one here, I have a little wheel that squeezes the paper together. So he would pull that, and printmakers will talk about pulling prints. In the print shops, you would have not only the person that pulled the print, but also the person that would take the letters, and they would place the letters through the tray. Looking at the letters, there are two types of letters that you use. What is the first letter that you use in a sentence? It's called a what? A capital letter, all right? What do you call the other letters, the lot smaller ones? You call those lowercase letters. Sometimes you call the capital letters that are big like this, with the larger, you would call these uppercase letters. And that is because you don't use these as often. And so they put them in a case that was higher up so that they didn't really need it in their way. And so they would take the lowercase letters and use those a lot. And that's where we get our words for uppercase and lowercase letters. So the next person was the inker, so he would ink. And then the next person would put it in the press and pull the press and make sure it pressed the paper onto the ink. And then the last person would take it off and proofread it or hang it up to dry, just to make sure that they didn't, all the ink dried. And then they would cut it with a knife, and then they could make it into a book or fold it over and make it into a newspaper. So that's the way the printing process went. It would be way too much for one person, and that's why they needed the apprentices to be able to follow and help, but also get the trade for themselves so they can carry on and become good printers in the long run. So one of the things that I have here is something that is made up of different letters. They're individual letters that I've set in here, and they create a word. And I'm not sure if you can read this or not, but it is backwards. Why would it be backwards? It's called a mirror image. When you flip your phones around, you can take a picture this way or that way. It's a mirror image. Well, this, when you print things, this will flip over to the other side and it'll look right. But they had to do everything backwards. So all those words and all those books, every one of them, everything's written backwards. And then they're printed and they look forwards, which is I think that would just really mess with your mind a lot, truthfully. The idea that what we have is to create with is, this is called an ink ball. And what they would do is they would take their ink and they would tap it on here and get just enough ink on there to print. The pictures, although, had to be carved out, and it's hard to find pictures that in the old-time newspapers in the colonial days even, that they didn't have a lot of illustrations because the illustrations had to be all carved out by hand on one block. So this one's a roller, and it too would be something that they put ink on with. I'm going to use what's called a brayer, and I'll be using my ink. Now my ink is, you can hear it's all wet like that. And what I'll do is I'll roll it across my image here. So, we've rolled this out. I'll wipe ink off. If I got ink on the side, that means it'll go on my papers, and that wouldn't be a good printer to be able to do that. The next thing we'll do is I will put a sheet of paper on here. I'll set the paper onto this where I want it. That's just to hold it down. And next I'll put this in my press. I'll take the blanket and put that on top. Now what the blanket will do is it will help the paper get pressed into the little grooves of the wood cuts here in the metal. So I'll push that in. Then I'll take my press, and now I'm going to run it through the press. And when it's finished, I'll take my blanket off. And then I have all sorts of little symbols and things from other newspapers and, typeset in there. So, as far as the printing in the Americas, we have people like Benjamin Franklin, who was just really in love with the printing. His brother had a printing business in Boston, and so he became part of it. He apprenticed with his brother, and that means he learned a trade. And back then, you didn't really have to have an education, but you needed a trade. So Ben Franklin went to work to learn the printing trade. He was so excited about that. When he was with his brother, it was the Pennsylvania Gazette, he was able to write things as well and print little things in a newsletter. And he did it under the name of, he didn't want anybody to know who he was, because that would be, it's a small town really back then.
Ben Franklin's pen name was Silence Dogood.
And that's what he wrote under. It was his secret name, and nobody knew who Silence Dogood was. But boy, they were talking about what he said in that newspaper. So eventually he moved and got his own print shop started. And of course he did things like Poor Richard's Almanac. He wrote the Poor Richard's Almanac not only as an almanac, but he had valuable information in it. But he also wrote little interesting thoughts like fish and visitors smell in 3 days. Well, that means after 3 days, your visitors, whether they be family or friends, need to move on out because everybody's tired of each other. So anyway, something that Ben Franklin really had a passion for. And he was interesting and was just an incredible person because of his love for science and his love for writing, his humor. He was a very social man, so he also wrote about the joining of the colonies. And one of the things that he did was he used this. It says join or die. I'm sure you've seen this before. And what he was saying that if all these places didn't get together, if the colonies didn't come together and be a strong unified front, we would never get away from the English, and we would never be able to create a new country the way we wanted to do. So this was a really nice thing. Remember I said there weren't that many illustrations in newspapers or books just because it was so hard to do. He did use this, and actually this probably became the first 18th century meme. Everybody thought it was just the best idea, and you see this used constantly all through history actually, and it's probably one of the most well-known political cartoons that we have today. The other thing that Ben Franklin was able to do is print money. He was given the right to print money from Pennsylvania, and he used these little bitty pieces that had leaves on them, and signed them, and it had some currency. And people were saying, oh, paper money, paper, it's not going to last, we should use gold. And he said, no, this is the way of the future. Print it on paper, and then you're good for it. And so that was a good thing. So he was just a real character. He loved to learn things. He loved making it interesting. He threw some jabs in those stories, and he also was able to keep people entertained with the funny part of it. He was an interesting fellow. For the Declaration of Independence, Ben Franklin suggested that it be printed on paper, and they talked it over, and they decided that paper was just still too new, and you don't know what's going to happen years and years and years to come, and so they decided they would write the Declaration of Independence on parchment. They knew that lasts for thousands of years, and they weren't going to change. Way back in 1630, family set off for the colonies, and the husband was a print shop owner, so he took his press, and of course his wife helped him in the shop, so the whole family did. So when they got to the colonies, lo and behold, the husband died, and so the wife was left with children and a press, and so she set up her own print shop in Plymouth, and she was the very first person to have a print shop in the colonies like that. So especially a woman. The other woman that you need to know about is Elizabeth Timothy, and she was the first woman to publish a newspaper in the colonies, and she did the South Carolina Gazette in Charleston, South Carolina. So she was in South Carolina, and she was a woman. She was doing her own printing and did a whole newspaper, which is really kind of a neat fact to know about South Carolina. So we now have made a lot of connections from the invention of paper. We have the invention of a printing press, and then all of a sudden the movable type on the printing press, and that was a big game changer. After that, it was just a matter of time that we ended up using the paper and the ideas and spread knowledge, like with Ben Franklin spreading ideas throughout the colonies, which led to the spread of knowledge for not only just a few people, but the whole world actually has access to reading materials. So printing played a huge part in the development of mankind for the past 1,000 years at least. So I want to thank the Belton Heritage Days Project for allowing me to have you into my studio and share my knowledge with you on printing, which is a great passion for me. So I hope you learned something new and enjoyed it. So Thank you very much.